At the start of the summer of 1929, almost a century ago, the world was about to fall off a cliff called the Great Depression. But in the new Shire of Noosa in southeast Queensland, the only thing that mattered to anyone was 2 new bridges and a 2-lane dirt road that would link the communities along the beautiful Noosa River for the very first time, opening up a whole new world of opportunity. And that was a serious reason to celebrate. This bridge, the Denella, and another one just like it at downriver there at Wyber Creek, they were the real beginnings of motorised tourism in Queensland. But the Depression and the Second World War would mean that Noosa would have to wait at least another generation before the promise of pioneer developer T.M. Burke began to be realised. And that was when things got really interesting. That's when Noosa's shady past looked like giving way to an even shadier future. That was when the character of Noosa started to develop. Over 100 years before T.M. Burke built the bridges that joined the river communities, and almost 200 years before the Noosa we know today started to develop, escapees from the Moreton Bay penal settlement, known collectively as the Wild White Men, bush-bashed their desperate way north and were taken in by the Kabi Kabi First Nation, who believed them to be the pale ghosts of their own dead family members. It was a surprisingly spiritual beginning to a relationship with the European settlers that was only going to end in tears. As the colony of Queensland expanded and squatters had free rein to take up traditional land, to cut timber, and later to dig for gold under the protection of the Queensland Native Mounted Police. In the fear and loathing that followed in these dark days, massacres became common, several of them within what would become Noosa Shire. After gold was discovered at Gympie in 1867, the trickle of people coming into Noosa turned into more of a torrent, particularly the case up here in what was then known as the Noosa Lakelands. And here where I am right now at Mill Point, this was basically the first upriver township that existed. The people who settled here at Mill Point did it really tough. I mean, it's not very far from Noosa as the crow flies, but they were in frontier land really. The logs would be loaded at Mill Point and they would float them down across the lake, joining up on the Noosa River, and from there a straight run down to Tewantin. Not only was Noosa potentially a seaport entry for the goldfields, but its Lakes District provided a vast source of timber to build a gold town. And the Noosa River, as shallow as it always has been, could float the logs downstream to a port facility that became known as Tewantin, a corruption of the Kabi Kabi word for dead wood, which also could have been an apt description for some of the hard men who came floating through this pop-up village. While the Noosa River became a staging point for the gold rush, particularly after Cobb & Co coaches made a direct connection to it, the new settlement of Tewantin became a riverside playground for lonely gold diggers and timber cutters, further widening the cultural gap between black and white. By the turn of the century, the motor car had been invented and the world was warming to a new thing called tourism. But in Noosa, the authorities perceived a problem. European settlement had forced the traditional owners of the land to the very edges of their own sacred ground to live in poverty. The Queensland Colonial government found the answer to this alleged impediment to progress in the form of a carnival huckster called Archibald Meston, who became the protector of Aborigines while profiting from their appearances in tawdry sideshows. When Meston introduced the Aborigines Protection Act in 1897, virtually the entire Kabi Kabi population of Noosa was incarcerated beyond their country at what would become known as the Cherbourg Mission. During the Second World War, the military started conducting jungle training exercises right here next to the river in this scrubby bush. And the men from the battalions that came here, mostly from Victoria, just fell in love with the place. and they particularly loved Maisie's favourite cafe, the only place on the river where you could eat and drink, just over there on Gippy Terrace, owned and run by the industrious fishing family, the Massos. After the war, many of the soldiers came back and joined the growing community of surfers, artists, adventurers, and, of course, the main chance guys wanting to turn a buck out of this new little paradise. In 1949, the Governor of Queensland stood here in the rain and declared the Noosa National Park officially open. But it didn't include the coastal strip, and back over here on the outer bays there were still parcels of land that were privately held. And within a decade, the barbarian developers were right here at the gate. The people who'd decided to make Noosa their home did so because they'd fallen in love with the place the way it was, not some homogenised dream of Pleasantville by the sea, and they were prepared to fight for it. The Harolds, the Fernleys, the Walkers, the Freemans, and many, many others joined forces in the Noosa Parks Association. Thus began a brave 60-year struggle that continues today. The NPA stopped the Headland Road and saved the park, and there were other famous victories. But the first real test of development versus the natural environment came when some of the biggest corporate names in the country decided to turn a mangrove swamp island into something called Noosa Sound. It's a beautiful place to build your dream home and park your boat. No one can deny that. But the artificial extension of pioneer Walter Hayes' little market garden, which was built on a mangrove swamp island, that brought it directly in line with the Noosa River mouth. And as surfers have always known, when coral sea lows and tropical cyclones start forming in late summer and early autumn, tranquil Laguna Bay can turn into a different kind of animal entirely.
Gale conditions continued to hammer the Sunshine Coast today, the surf, the rain and wind taking their toll in different ways. But it was the combination of the huge seas and a king tide that wrought the most damage, mainly in the Noosa Heads area this morning. Beachfront Noosa and only the rock retaining wall holding back the surging swell. The wall held today, but the wind-blown waves crashing over it managed to eat into soil behind the rocks and sent lashing spray hurtling into waterfront buildings. Authorities kept up around-the-clock check to see that no weak points could develop. But a king tide around 10 o'clock this morning brought damage. Fast-rising water backed up in canals near the surf, creating a three-sided attack around the beach shopping centre. The waters quickly rose above bank levels, surging across motel properties, and at one point at the junction of the river mouth and a canal, flowed into the main street.
After cyclones pounded Noosa Sound in 1976 and 78, the monumental decision was made to protect the development by extending the beach and moving the river mouth northeast. In the words of Huey, the god of surf, you should never screw with Mother Nature. Although Noosa Sound can't be blamed for everything, the problems of erosion and silting that we still have today can be directly attributed to moving the river mouth. Noosa learned a valuable lesson, but the challenges to our natural environment kept on coming.
Beside the Hastings Street village strip lies Laguna Bay, with its north-facing beach a sun trap, sheltered by the headland of Noosa National Park.
By the 1980s, Noosa Shire had a new council chambers, a new conservationist council, trendy European-style restaurants and cafes, and a rapidly growing population.
Don't let another day set on your decision to relax a while, Noosa style.
It would be a long time to come before the phrase "love to death" was coined, but already the visionaries of this town were thinking about how to keep the population in check and how to keep the village atmosphere alive. Then Mayor Noel Playford, academic and town planner Michael Gloucester and others worked out a way to control population growth through land zonings. The population cap was innovative and not universally popular, but every time you think about traffic lights and parking meters, you can thank those visionaries. Today, Noosa is home to more than 50,000 people and loved by tourists from around the world. The challenges keep coming, but it's a strong, vibrant and smart community that's up to meeting them. The celebrated author, playwright and poet Dr. Nancy Cato lived in Noosa for the last 30 plus years of her life. And Nancy was always out there as an environmental warrior in front of the bulldozers or at the barricades because that's who she was. When Nancy published this book, The Noosa Story, in 1979, it was a warning to all of us that we could so easily destroy what we'd come to enjoy. More than 40 years later, my history of Noosa, Place of Shadows, is a very different book, but it too presents the good, the bad and the ugly, inspired by Nancy. Our former mayor, Tony Wellington, an environmentalist and surfer, once told me that here on Main Beach, looking out at Laguna Bay, is where you can find the key to why we love Noosa. If you look to your left, Tony said, you can see the Great Sandy National Park on land that was meant for mining and development and has been conserved over a 50-year struggle. Or if you look this way, you're looking at Noosa National Park, which is one of the most beautiful national parks in Australia, if not the world. And what that might have been if, like most headlands in Australia, we'd allowed a coastal dress circle road to be built instead of this park. That's what we'd be looking at today. My wife and I have lived here now for over 30 years, and our kids all live here, and their kids are growing up here. Noosa's our home, that's our place of the heart, and I guess that's why I've written Place of Shadows. But I also think it's important, and I hope you'll agree with me, that you have to not only look back at the challenges that we've faced and the way that we've faced up to them and learn from that, but also I think we've got to look forward with a great deal of positivity because Noosa can never be compromised. We've come this far, we've got challenges ahead, but Noosa is such a wonderful place to live. So I hope that you'll love reading the book as much as I loved writing it. It's an important book, and I think it tells an important story. Place of Shadows.